So, ladies and gentlemen, here we are again. Erwin, are there some questions?
Yes, we have received 2 questions. The first one is, what is a force from a theosophical point of view?
Well, that's a good question. As I try to explain, in Theosophy, everything is alive. So when we're talking about force or matter or whatever, it's always a living thing. So force for us is actually the same as consciousness. So in general, when we use the word force, it is applied to the more material side of the universe, of the hierarchy of which we are part. But in fact, there is no difference between force or consciousness or whatever name you, vibration, sometimes it's called vibration, life, doesn't matter, it's all life, it's all the same. The only difference between all those, stages is the evolution phase in which something is. So if it's from our point of view, very far in its evolution, we call it spirit, or we call it a God, divine. And when it's not so far in its evolution, we call it material or substance, or between it, sometimes we call it force, and in science, they used to speak of force, but it's all consciousness, all consciousness. So consciousness, matter, it's all the same. It's only one element. That's why H.P. Blavatsky speaks in the Secret Doctrine of the substance consciousness principle. Yeah. There's a second question.
Yeah, and a third coming up. The second question is, can I say that the soul has a bridge function, and will that function always exist?
Yes, that's a good question, and the answer is yes. There's always between we call it sometimes the monad, the divine spark, yeah, spirit, the relative highest element in our being, in our consciousness, the spirit, and you have this the vehicle side, the instrument, and between those two, there's always a bridge. Actually, if you zoom in a little bit more, you will find out that soul is also consists of more elements, but in general we may call it a soul, and the soul is so directed to the spirit side and to the vehicle side, the material side. It's between the two. So it's a bridge, yeah.
Okay, more questions coming in. The third is, how does Jungian psychology, so the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, relate to this view of consciousness?
Well, I'm not very... I know a little bit of Gustav Jung, but I know that he also assumed that consciousness is the basis of the vehicle side of matter, of the manifestation. So in that very essential point, I think there is no difference between Theosophy and Carl Jung, but in detail, but I'm not an expert, in detail there are some differences between the two, but I can't tell you exactly what are the differences.
Okay, then another question is, can you elaborate on what you name passive force?
Yeah, it seems a contradiction, passive force. Well, it's a force like the examples I gave, the beating of the heart. It's not a will-driven force. So there is no question of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness means that a consciousness is aware of itself. He can reflect his consciousness on himself, and he is able to choose whether he does something or not. The unconscious force in our body, for instance, but the unconscious force is also in nature, is more or less an automatic force, but that's a dangerous word, but it seems as if I use the word automatic that you think it's not alive, but it's a living force, but still, from the perspective of a human being, so undeveloped that it seems to us that the processes are automatic. So for us, it's a passive force. There is one thing in Theosophy that makes it sometimes more difficult and sometimes easier to understand, and that is that everything is relative. So what for us is a passive force, maybe for beings who are much, much less developed than the beings that consist that passive form, is a little bit active. And what for us is an active force, maybe for the beings who are much further developed than we are, passive. So all is relative. But from the standpoint of a human being, a passive force in our existence, in our consciousness, is the processes that regulates our body. And in nature, the processes that regulates outer nature. Nature as we can perceive it. But behind nature as we can perceive it, there are inner forces. And those inner forces we cannot perceive with our senses, but they exist also. So nature is not the plants and the animals that are around us, but nature is the whole complex of beings. Some of them we can see, but most of them we cannot see. And the beings who have a self-consciousness, so who are aware of themselves, and also this is a relative term, they are what you may call an active force, and the beings who don't have self-consciousness are the passive force in nature.
Okay, thank you. Those were the questions.
Okay, now we promise you that we will focus on karma. Well, the first important implication of the doctrine of reincarnation is that a human being is not a tabula rasa, a blank state, a blank sheet of paper. We take our past with us, nor does a human being get his character from his parent. Every human being has a past, and even if he doesn't know that past, at least he doesn't know the details, he could know what he was in past life if he has an understanding of what he is now. Just as you cannot separate yesterday from today, so you cannot disconnect your present life from previous lives. So, you have studied mathematics, for example, for many months of years. Then it's obvious that you understand mathematics better than someone who has not studied it. And why? Because if you don't study math, but let's say you play football, you created other causes, namely that you are good in football and not good in math. Cause and consequence. And you see the teaching of karma is in fact very simple. And why have you or have you not studied mathematics? Well, people can choose. They choose to study or they choose not to study. Now you may immediately object that some children are born into an environment where study is a common thing, and other children are born into an environment where there is not even a single book in the house. So where is the free will? Well, that's a fair question. And indeed, you can say that not everyone has an equal free will. And if you compare, for example, the free will of a human being with that of an animal, the free will of a human being is much greater, and therefore the responsibility for his action is also greater. In general, you can say that the greater the consciousness of a being, the more extensive its free will is. And how vast or how limited your consciousness is, and consequently how strong your free will is, has everything to do with previous lives. So if we talk about free will, we should try to expand our vision, and we should include in these considerations our past lives as well. And of course, this doesn't only relate to math, but this relates to everything that we are. The total package of knowledge, skills, insight, and so on that we have acquired and that we actually are. So it's all about our character. How do we get our character? Our character is the total sum of all the actions we perform. And as we said, action is actually karma. So our actions are our karma. Now there's always a thought underlying an action. And by the way, there's also a thought behind a non-action. That thought can be very different. It can be a selfish thought, a compassionate thought, emotional, intellectual thought, idealistic thought. It doesn't matter. But there is always a thought that leads to an action or a non-action. And if you think that thought often enough, if you perform those actions frequently, then a habit arises. And the collection of your habits is your habit pattern or your character. And therefore, you can say you saw a thought and you reap an action. And you saw an action, you reap a habit, and you saw a habit and you reap a character. Now, it is that character which is thus formed on the basis of cause and effect, on the basis of our free will, because you thought those thoughts freely. That character is attracted exactly to the circumstances where it belongs, indeed, where it can become itself. The environment is in fact nothing but the reflection of our character. And that idea becomes easier to grasp when you realize that attraction comes from within you, fooled by what you have made yourself. That attraction, like a magnet, has two poles, a negative and a positive pole. The negative pole we call antipathy or hatred, and the positive pole is sympathy or love. These two forces are the binding forces in life and cause people to end up where they have chosen for. Perhaps out of ignorance, or whether or not with noble or selfish motives, but they have chosen to love or hate somebody, or like or dislike a situation or person or a group of persons. Now, it's not so difficult to understand that love is a binding force. Everyone wants to be with those they love and to do the things they enjoy and like. But that hate is also a binding force, is much harder to understand. But if you stop and think about yourself, ponder about yourself, you can still come to that conclusion. After all, about what a person thinks, what thoughts does one think? Well, a person thinks about those things he likes and about those things he doesn't like. And each thought makes an impression in our consciousness, an impression in ourselves, leading to a change, perhaps a very small one, in our habitual pattern. Just ask yourself which people from the past you still remember. Which teachers do you still remember? Probably the teachers you liked, those of whom you thought they were good teachers, but probably also the ones you didn't like, or maybe even hated, or of whom you thought they weren't good teachers, and the teachers who always punish you. They have left an impression in your consciousness as well. But there are also teachers you didn't like, nor dislike, of whom you thought they were not good and not bad. You probably can't even remember them or remember their names. They have not made any impression in your consciousness, and therefore you have not forged a bond with them. So you see why all the great world teachers have told us not to hate. Hatred creates a bond. It creates a bond with the one we hate, which leads to a downward spiral of struggle and misery. And that's why people can find themselves in circumstances in which they wonder, why am I in this situation? Imagine you hate soccer and you are constantly annoyed by soccer on TV and by your colleagues' conversations about soccer. You constantly tell them that soccer is a stupid sport. Well, if you do that, then there is a good chance that in your next life you will be born into a sport family. That is the explanation for the so-called black sheep in a family. And negativity attracts. Another example. Do you know who is constantly thinking about God? The believer, the good Christian, and the atheist. The believer wants to prove that God exists, and the atheist wants to prove that he doesn't exist. And so they create a very close tie with each other. And therefore, it is the character that is attracted to the circumstances in which a human being can become himself. And hence, we can add to this axiom, thought, action, habit, character. You saw a character and you reap a new reincarnation. So in every circumstance we are in, not one excepted, we are confronted with our own actions and thoughts. We always reap what we have sown. The law of karma is therefore rightly called the law of cause and effect. Every action leads to an appropriate reaction. It's a neutral process. There is no such thing as good and bad karma. Karma is a strictly neutral law which brings exactly the corresponding consequence to a cause. The law of cause and effect is not strange or unfamiliar in our society. For instance, in physics and chemistry, all laws are based on it. But this law is not limited just to the physical world. Theosophy teaches that this law of cause and effect is applicable to the physical world, of course, but also to the psychic world, the mental world, the spiritual worlds, all worlds. In the first part of this talk, I was talking about the underlying reality, the underlying unity, about the omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle. Well, in that boundlessness, hierarchies of life emerge, in which everything is interrelated, where the same laws apply, where what one does affects all the others. Everything is karma. Compare it with a spider's web. See the whole cosmos as a spider's web, as a web of destiny. Each thread is a smaller web of destiny, part of the larger web. So any movement in that web caused by one of the smaller webs causes the entire web to move. And of course, the closer a being is to the source of the action, and to the being who acted, the greater the effect will be. Nevertheless, the effect of the action will vibrate throughout the whole web, and eventually the movement will lead back to that part in the web, to that being who initiated the movement, who performed the action, who sought the karmic cause, and consequently will also have to reap the karmic consequence. There is no escape from that. And therefore, karma is also called the law of restoration of harmony. Every act, especially if done out of selfish motives, brings about a certain disharmony. What causes this disharmony to arise? Well, there is unity in life. There is coherence, there is interrelationship. Everything is connected. Selfishness is actually a kind of blindness. You don't see the true nature of life. Selfishness comes from the feeling of separateness, the illusion that you are separate from others, and therefore you don't consider others in your thoughts and actions, but unity exists. Brotherhood is a fact in life. So that selfish acts evokes a counter-reaction, the balance must be restored. And therefore karma is the law of restoring balance, the restoration of harmony. Think deeply about karma as an overarching web of which all beings are part. Let this picture penetrate deeply in you, and that takes some time. You have to think about it, you have to ponder about it. Maybe it takes several years, maybe even lives. But then you start to understand that there is actually no such thing as my karma and your karma. And why not? Because there is no separateness. Because everything is not only connected, but is essentially a unity. Karma is Atma, a master once said. Karma exists because of the unity of life. And that's why it's so difficult to retrace exactly which cause gave rise to a specific effect. You are walking under a tree and a branch falls on your head, forcing you to go to hospital. Why didn't you walk under the tree a minute later or earlier? You missed your plane. And in the evening you read in the newspaper that that plane had crashed. Is it a coincidence that you were not in it? No. But exactly what caused you to miss that plane can only be determined by someone who oversees the totality of life, a master of wisdom and compassion, someone who can perceive more and trace the consequences to the causes. The principle of karma is very simple. You saw what you reap, but the specific effect, if you want to understand that, if you want to see through that, then you have to elevate yourself to the highest part in yourself, to the highest part of the hierarchy of which you are an inseparable part, and you can see what causes, or better, what range of causes led you to not dying prematurely, so missing that plane. So if you want to know exactly which specific cause led to which specific effect, you must fully live within your higher self. Nevertheless, if you are honest with yourself, you can, for yourself, determine why you are in a certain situation, why you live with the people you live with. Those men and women around you are like a mirror. Something of you reflects in them. So see, karma as a neutral law. There is no such thing as good karma and bad karma. There is karma. If you put your finger in the fire, you will hurt yourself. Is the fire bad? And if the fire is used to cook your food, is it good? No, the fire is the fire. And the way we use or abuse it determines its color, determines if we experience it as good or bad. We are inclined, thinking from our personality, to interpret the circumstances we find pleasant and agreeable as good karma, and to interpret the circumstances we find painful and which causes suffering as bad karma. But that is wrong. It is all karma. It is all, in all those cases, is cause and effect, regardless of what we think of it. Again, karma is a neutral law, and that actually means that happiness and unhappiness are always in your own hands. Although you cannot change the situation where you are in, because the causes are sown already, what's done cannot be undone. But this doesn't mean that you have doomed yourself to react in a certain way. You are free to react. There is no power outside yourself that dictates you, that dooms you how you should react in a certain situation. That's your own free will. Take the current pandemic as an example. It was created by us, humanity, as a collective. But how we respond to it is a matter of free will. We can complain it, we can curse it, we can even go around in the city like vandals and loot stores, but we can also go and study. Finally, read that book we have been dying to read, improve our skills in playing a musical instrument, or reflect on ourselves, reflect on the unity of life. That is our choice. Now, of course, if you have made choices in one direction for many years, maybe many lives, it's more difficult to make other choices. You have, so to speak, predestined yourself to repeat choices, because the thoughts underlying actions, like everything in nature, recur cyclically. So in a way, you have doomed yourself to repeat the thoughts you have thought and repeat the actions you have performed. If you have spent many lives thinking of yourself that you are the center of the world and that your fellow humans are your subordinates, then it becomes difficult to think thoughts of compassion and universal love. What you have basically done is that you have curtailed your own free will. You made it smaller. You are making the number of possibilities between which you can choose smaller. Your consciousness wants to flow automatically in the bed that your thoughts have worn out over many, many years. But in yourself, in the heart of your heart, you are the top of the hierarchy. Yes, you are the boundless. And you possess all faculties, all the possibilities of taking the helm and change your life. So ultimately, karma is a teaching of hope, hope for the future. We'll go into that in more detail later. But first, there is a break of 3 minutes, and then I will try to answer your questions again. Well, here we are. There are some questions I heard. Erwin?
Yes, a few questions came in. One is a conclusion based on the things you have said, that karma is not one-on-one. As if you hit someone in the face, you will be hit back in the face eventually.
Well, that's a very difficult question, but I think that if you hit somebody out of hatred or out of whatever it may be, you will reap the consequence, what it is if someone beats you, if someone hits you. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the one who you have beaten should beat you, but you have to go to that same experience of being beaten. And, you know, if you study the situations between people, the relationship between people, you see how difficult it is, because I don't know if it was to hurt somebody out of hatred, or maybe it was a parent who beats his child in a way because he thought that was good for their education. So it's very difficult to give a specific answer, but in general you may say that whatever you do to somebody, you have to experience what it is to go through that situation. For instance, another example, if a man treats his lady, he will experience what it is if somebody who trusts you will betray you. And that doesn't mean that his wife should betray him, but he has to experience, maybe just only in his mind, what it is to be betrayed, so he can learn his lesson. I think that in general is the law of karma.
Next question, if we plant seeds in our daily lives through our thinking and actions, then we also have to harvest them. What role then does our free will play? After all, we cannot escape harvesting.
No, we cannot escape harvesting. What's done cannot be undone, as Shakespeare says that in one of his plays. But we can harvest it with a smile, happy that we are able to harvest it, or we can harvest it, you know, in a bad mood and, you know, complaining, why me, why it's always me. And that is our free will. So our happiness is in our hands, because it's not the circumstances which make you happy or unhappy, but it's your reaction on the circumstances which make you happy or unhappy. And in that point, we are free. We are free to harvest what we have sown the way we want. And sometimes, you know, if the circumstances are bad, we may also think, well, I can learn a lot of it. And maybe it's better difficult circumstances than lying on the beach for the rest of my life, because I'm not learning anything on that beach. But if I get difficulties and maybe problems with my neighbors or my work, well, that may be difficult, and maybe it's difficult for me to cope with it, but I can learn a lot of it. And if you see this life as a link between former lives and next lives, yeah, it is, according to Theosophy, nothing but a link between, yeah, a series of lives, then you better have a life with difficulties and where it's difficult to harvest things, because you learn a lot. You can grow in spiritually, you can grow in consciousness, you can awaken a lot of aspects in you which you couldn't have awakened if you had a smooth and easy life.
Okay. 3 more questions. One is that Buddhism, Vasabandhu Abhidharma, teaches the incarnating entity to have access to his previous lives during the 7th month of pregnancy, and then forget it due to the trauma of birth. Is there any similar idea as that in Theosophy?
Well, there is a quotation of a letter of one of the Masters of Wisdom, who says some of us, some of the masters, is able to look back in past lives, but he says, he writes to AP Synod, we normally don't use that faculty because we don't like it. So what I want to say is, if you really want to look back in former lives, you have to elevate yourself to the higher aspects of your being, what we call Buddhi, Atman. You can't find it in the personality. There's another thing which is important to know, and we have not so much time, so in a lot of details we couldn't tell, but at the process of dying, the personality, in fact, elevates itself to the higher aspects of the consciousness and looks back on his life. We call that the panoramic view. And he sees all the events, all the actions, all the thoughts he performed and he thought in his last life. And he sees the causes and the consequences. And I see why he lived in that situation, why he met that man, why he married that woman, etc., etc. So that's a real situation. Then, the moment we are born again, there is the same panoramic view, but now on a future life. You see, well, I have sown this cause, and that means that in this life I will reap these consequences. So there are actually three, but I just speak about two panoramic views on which the reincarnating ego, the higher manas, not the personal man, but the higher manas, sees what's going to happen. And sometimes you may have, a kind of remembrance of that, so you know something which is going to happen. Those doctrines of Buddhism that you can look back to your former lives, well, I don't know nothing about that, but I think that it was certainly not a purpose of Buddhism to look back to former lives. But it doesn't help you. It doesn't help you. I don't know if it's true, but it doesn't help you. Because I think it's even, it makes life more difficult. If you only know how many people in this life have traumas because of their youth, because of, maybe the parents treated them badly or whatever. So it's so difficult to cope with one life. Imagine that you knew what was happening in your past life of 3 or 4 lives ago. It will block you. For the most people, it will be very difficult to cope with it. So nature knows better than we human beings, because it's not something that helps us in our evolution to know what happened in our former life. So it's not really an answer to the question, because I simply don't know, but maybe it helps to get some idea why we don't know anything about our former lives. That means the details, and why it is good that we don't know nothing about our former lives.
Okay, a bit connected to this question, especially when you talk about panoramic visions and having connection to a higher consciousness. Someone remarks, would this explain why some little children are so wise, perhaps wiser than their ages? Yeah, that's a good question. It's a difficult question to answer because you should know a lot of details. But, the process of reincarnation is in fact a process of evolution and involution. And those processes are the same. And evolution is, developing, unpacking, what is within the consciousness you develop, you like a present, you take it out. And evolving is in-wrapping. Now, what happens when a child is born, or what happens when human consciousness, a human being,
feels the thirst to manifest itself, the Krishna. Well, the spiritual part enwraps itself, we call that involution, and the physical aspect develops itself. It's a similar process. So a baby is in fact divine material. And all the other aspects, manas, kama, buddhi, they are not yet active. So little children, especially babies, you know, a lot of people when they are in the neighborhood of a little children, baby, they feel a kind of sacredness. And when the child becomes a little bit more older, say 1, 2, 3, 4 years, all the ideas of the world are not yet accessible for him. He still lives in those divine atmosphere in which he stayed during the rest period, which we call death. And that's why he notices other things, he perceives other things than grown-up do. And so they can make some statements, say something, perceive something. In our eyes, is very wise because we are, you know, in a way accustomed with the thoughts of daily life that we don't see the more noble, abler, Buddhic thoughts. And that's why sometimes children are wiser than grown-up.
Next question. Why do good actions or acts seem to be so minimally noticeable? If I place this in the idea of the spider's web you talked about, somewhere it should be noticed and everything is in motion. So, yeah, could you say that these good acts are, why are these so minimally noticeable?
Well, I don't know if it's true, but in general you can say that if you are working on with nature, the movement you make in the spider's web is less than if you are working against nature. So if you are selfish, because then you disturb the web of destiny. And good actions, and that is unselfish actions, compassionate actions, you cooperate with nature. But I think, but maybe I don't understand the question, but I think that good actions are also noticed. I mean, everybody knows about Mahatma Gandhi, about Nelson Mandela, about Malala, and all the good people who perform actions and we are very happy for that, are noticed by other ones and can inspire us to do the same. Unfortunately, there are still exceptions because a lot of people still live in their personality, in the feeling of separateness, and this always leads to a kind of selfishness, which is more common, especially combined with desire and the lower manas, the intellect, is still more common than those idealistic thoughts and actions, but they exist. And the more you live in your higher part of your being, the more you will notice the idealistic thoughts and actions of others as well. Because, hate and love are two binding forces. So if you live in the higher part of yourself, you will automatically attracted to those people, and we will notice those people who are, we have the same mentality. So it's also a question of perceiving it.
Okay, last question. If as above, so below, why is there no balancing of karmic occurrences? Why are karmic conditions enacted on the material world? how does the soul benefit from lessons of the material world?
Well, karma is everywhere. It's physical, emotional, spiritual. Karma is cause and effect, a nutrual law. It's everywhere. But it depends on the soul. If you say the soul, the manas, if the soul identifies itself with the material world, it will reap on the material world. And if the soul identifies itself with the spiritual world, it will reap on the spiritual world. Yeah? So it's very simple. Most people are focused on the material side of life. They live in the cave of Plato, and they think that the shadows on the wall of the cave are true. So they identify themselves with the outer world and not with the inner world. So if you identify with the outer world, that means that the soul is focused on the material side of life. You will harvest on that side of life. But if you are focused on the spiritual side, well, it will give you insight. It will give you connections with people who also are spiritual and want to know more about nature and so on. And then you will reap consequences on the inner side of life. So it all depends on ourselves. Yeah? What are we? What do we want? Why are we focusing on? It's all karma.
Thanks. Those are the questions.
Okay. Well, before the break, I told you that